Wouldn't you love to hop in a DeLorean and go back to 1969 to see how people stayed so slender? I was there for it. My weekend job as a teen was to caddy for one of the greatest health influencers the world has ever known.
I consider myself a scientific nutritionist, trying to get you to eat the proper foods for beauty and for good health. It's just that simple.
Back then, America's weight and health was in the ballpark of other industrial nations. But as the future came, a disaster unfolded for America's health. We should have predicted it because Doc Brown and Marty McFly drove their DeLorean into the future to take a look.
Great Scott! Doc, where are we? According to my calculations, this is the year 2015, Marty. The future.
Great Scott! And it only took Doc Brown a few minutes to understand one of the problems.
And all these people just got here in their flying cars.
No, you know what? We never figured out flying cars, actually. We never did figure that out.
If you don't mind me asking, what the hell have you guys been doing for 30 years?
Oh, you know what? We invented this thing called a cronut. It's like part croissant and part donut, and they put them together, and it's actually quite delicious. Really good.
Oh man, cronuts and Doritos. Doritos were just boring corn chips before the multi-billion-dollar artificial flavor and color industries turned them into sensations. But that can't explain it all. Doritos are widely available in countries like Japan, France, and Denmark, who are slender like we were in the 60s. Our obesity rate was 13% in 1969, and France's is 11% today. So, Doc Brown, is there a bigger factor than junk food at play?
I believe we may have inadvertently traveled into an alternate 2015, where human evolution has been stopped. Apparently, the technological and cultural achievements of this era.
And that, I believe, gets closer to the heart of the problem, more important than junk food. Trust in science in America has gone in reverse. In 1969, we landed a man on the moon.
Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin.
Everyone knew we led the world in science. Time's Men of the Year were scientists. The American epidemiologist D.A. Henderson led the effort to eradicate smallpox in the 60s, funded by USAID. He was honored with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And that is what caused me to pursue a career in science. But tragically, while we led the world in science in the 60s, we now lead the world in science denial. Scientists are no longer leading scientific agencies like NASA. They're being fired, and countries around the world are recruiting them. What does this have to do with what happened to America's health since the 60s, you ask? I think trust in science is the second most important indicator of a population's health after poverty. For example, here's what one of the most famous doctors in America, Mark Hyman, who is not a nutrition scientist, had to say about nutrition science. 40 years of lies. That doesn't sound like trust in science. In a few minutes in this episode, you'll hear from the most cited scientist in the world in any field, who is a nutrition scientist, and you can judge for yourself whether he's lying. Did you just have a big birthday?
Right, yes, yeah.
A big 8-0?
I did, yes.
Yeah.
It was my goal to ride 80 miles on a bike for my birthday. I did 2 days in a row of 85 miles.
Wow. Let's see if I can back up my very bold claim that trust in science is the leading indicator of a population's health after poverty. First, here are 4 countries whose dietary guidelines have looked substantially the same for 50 years. The top 3 believe so strongly in what Mark Hyman calls 40 years of lies, they teach it to their children in schools. The bottom country, America, leaves it up to everyone to choose their own adventure. We can choose from a plethora of mega influencers with dueling diets. None of them are nutrition scientists. All of them have major side hustles to become wealthy. Life expectancy in America is 5 to 7 years less than it is in countries that teach nutrition guidelines from actual nutrition scientists to children in their schools. And those scientists rarely have side hustles to get wealthy. More on that later. Example number 2, Asian Americans live 7 years longer than white Americans in America, and they have less than half the obesity rate. And yet, white American Adventists near Los Angeles outlive Asian Americans by roughly 3 years. Surveys consistently place Asian Americans as having much higher trust in science than white or black Americans. The only population I'm aware of that scores higher are Adventists, because their church promotes medical science as a partner in faith. A telling indicator of trust in science is vaccination rate. It's consistently 95% among Asian Americans and much lower among white and black populations, especially in high mortality states in the South where trust in science is lowest. The only population I know with even higher vaccination rates than Asians are Adventists. This is a longevity channel, so I'll be struck by lightning if I don't mention how profoundly vaccinations affect longevity. I'm not aware that vaccines have anything to do with autism, but there is very convincing evidence that they significantly reduce our risk of Alzheimer's. We even have a couple of probable mechanisms, such as reducing inflammation caused by disease. You can spend a ton of money on tech to improve longevity with uncertain outcomes, or you can just walk to Walgreens and spend a few bucks on a flu vaccine and be pretty confident you've reduced your risk of Alzheimer's. That's why I think it's a national tragedy that the most popular influencers who don't even know the very basics of epidemiology and never invite epidemiologists on their channels claim epidemiology is weak or a joke. I made an episode about that. Imagine how many people are suffering the tragedy of Alzheimer's because they're not hearing from actual epidemiologists. I am a child of the 50s. Church bells rang across the nation, factory whistles blew, and people celebrated in the streets when the polio vaccine proved effective because we all knew people who were paralyzed by it. Look at how confident we were back then. Now we all know people with Alzheimer's. We need Doc Brown to fix this.
Marty, I need you to stay here while I travel back to 1985, figure out where this all went wrong, and repair the space-time continuum.
Oh, wow. All right.
Okay, I just set our comment section on fire with ragey comments, which is ironic considering that rage reduces longevity. I'll make an episode on vaccines and longevity, so subscribe if you want to see those fireworks. But is it really fair of me to say Americans have lost faith in all of science? Americans don't question what our telescopes are revealing about the galaxies. We don't question the health benefits science is revealing about reasonable exercise. So why do we believe in some branches of science and not in others? Since I have worked in both environmental epidemiology and in Silicon Valley tech, boy, do I have a perspective on that. Every environmental epidemiologist knows how threatening what you do is to big industries and how they are coming for you. They will just make up things about you and your science to discredit you. They will lobby to cut your funding. They may threaten to sue you. They will run ads and PR campaigns to defend the indefensible. It was really hard for young, idealistic Chris to get my head around that so many people will shamelessly attack science for profit. All epidemiologists have to defend themselves is honest science and their own modest salaries. The reason companies spend so much to discredit science is they know that epidemiology has the power to wreck their industry, as it has done to lead, mercury, smoking, trans fats, asbestos, an untold number of chemicals, food additives, and artificial sweeteners. Companies in space and exercise science have no incentive to discredit science because they make money selling telescopes and treadmills.
A lot of people seem to like the refractor I brought.
When I worked in tech, I was so lucky to be on a relatively small team that pioneered the smartphone.
Actually, this is the best thing about the future. It's called a smartphone.
Great Scott! It's a tiny supercomputer.
Yeah. It is. It's like...
This must allow astrophysicists to triangulate complex equations in real time.
I guess it probably could do that, but mainly we use it to send little smiley faces to each other.
Apple had every incentive to market us as geniuses. The documentary about us was the most popular documentary in the world for 2 years, part of in-flight entertainment, and I'm in it. I was on stage at film festivals signing autographs. It was utterly fascinating to work closely with the legends of tech like Steve Jobs and Bill Atkinson and compare them to epidemiologists. Steve told me that Bill Atkinson was one of the 2 brightest scientists he had ever worked with. Was Bill more brilliant than the epidemiologist you'll be hearing from in a few minutes? Well, in tech, you're under so much competitive pressure to move fast that you make a ton of mistakes. But generally, the public still loves you. Epidemiologists have to be much more methodical so their data can stand up in court if they want to abolish dangerous chemicals. I made an episode about that. So they need to be nearly bulletproof. So they move cautiously and slowly. But I could not notice any difference in the scientific ability of top tech scientists versus top epidemiologists. Both of them have changed the world many times, and their science has stood the test of time. One thing I did notice is not everyone in tech is doing it for the good of humanity. The temptation to do it for money and fame is strong, just like it is for nutrition influencers. Epidemiologists are far more likely to be in it for the good of humanity. Why else would they endure the PR campaigns that defame them? One last thing before we get to Walter's interview is I want to give an example of how industry and influencers work together to destroy consumer confidence in science. This one is directed at Walter. There is a Norwegian doctor, wealthy by marriage, who gave a great TED Talk.
If we get it right on food, we can fix some of our greatest global challenges. Even economists agree. If we all simply followed the dietary guidelines on meat, the world could save more than $700 billion a year in healthcare costs. That's about 7 times as much as we spend on cancer drugs globally each year.
Countries all over the world had created dietary guidelines, but nutrition had been their primary focus. Agriculture is generally thought to be the second biggest factor in planetary destruction, including deforesting half the earth. I gave a TEDx talk about that. I have a lopsided beard today, and that's to represent our global forests. We've converted about half of them, a little less than half, to farmland. So on the left I have forests, and on the right I have farmland. And somebody made the crack yesterday that I represent deserts really well where nothing will grow. I don't think my look is going to catch on, but I get a big kick out of Siri trying to grapple with face recognition now.
What happened to your face?
It has created a global water crisis. It adds greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. It's a big polluter, etc. Gunhild made the primary focus of her charitable foundation figuring out the enormously complicated problem of what can we eat that's healthy but also doesn't poison our water or other tragedies. What grabbed my attention were the scientists that she recruited to the cause. It reminds me of what Steve Jobs told us so many times. Find the best person in the world and don't settle for second best. She picked Johan Rockström to lead the earth science portion of EAT Lancet, and I think every earth scientist would say she could not have picked better. My degrees are in geophysics, and he has been one of my greatest heroes for a very long time. And she picked Walter for the nutrition side. And together they chose a team of 37 mostly university scientists from 16 countries with impeccable reputations for EAT Lancet 1.0 in 2019. They worked for 3 years on their first report, and then another 3 for EAT Lancet 2.0, this time with 70 scientists. Having worked in environmental epidemiology, my first instinct was to think, which big industry will feel so threatened by this they'll launch a huge PR campaign to fight it? They always do. This report was one of the most threatening to industries because it's one of the most cited reports of the last decade and influenced dietary guidelines all around the world. Of course, it was obviously beef because on the nutrition side, every country's dietary guideline recommends minimizing red meat or eliminating it altogether. Consumers in America are fleeing to chicken. But beef's problems are way worse on the environmental side than for nutrition because beef towers over any other food with regard to land use, water use, greenhouse gases, and poisoning our groundwater. You would think that beef is in a terribly weak position because science is not on their side, so they did what every threatened industry does. They hired a big PR firm. Then they gathered whatever influencers they could find that are willing to defend the indefensible and launch a coordinated campaign. You can do so many things in a PR campaign scientists won't do. One example is to turn it into a culture war. Gunhild is wealthy, so just claim the elites are telling us what we can eat. After all, rage is the most viral emotion. There is a nonprofit in the Netherlands, changingmarkets.org, which made a report about how the campaign worked. They received leaked audio from a meeting the beef industry held with influencers in Colorado, where they settled on messages and hashtags like hashtag #YesToMeat. One weakness in all these campaigns is it's hard to find credible scientists who are willing to defend the indefensible, even if they can get a house in the Hamptons or a yacht as a reward. In my view, the real science that EAT Lancet advanced was in earth science. We've had consistent dietary guidelines around the world for decades that are working for healthy countries. What we haven't fully understood in the modern era is which foods are poisoning our water, destroying our forests and oceans, and heating the planet. How do we design a healthy diet around foods that don't do that? I could not imagine how they could find a legitimate earth scientist who would defend beef. The Changing Markets report listed the key influencers who were defending beef in this campaign. And to no one's surprise, most are American, none are earth or nutrition scientists, and all of them are willing to make things up. For example, here's Brett Schur from Metabolic Mind.
If you listen to the recent publication in the committee behind EAT Lancet and their report for a planetary healthy diet, it would be to eliminate all animal products and eat a plant-based diet.
But he never showed what the EAT Lancet diet actually is. It has a significant slice of animal-based foods, just like every other dietary guideline in the world.
This dietary pattern is flexible. We wanted to make the tent as big as we could, and you could have this as a vegan diet, all the animal sources of protein being replaced by plant sources of protein. It could be a pescatarian version of the diet, a vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet.
But it didn't go as far as Denmark, Spain, and Switzerland because it even includes some red meat. Here's Georgia Eade, a psychiatrist, not an earth scientist, not a nutrition scientist, not an epidemiologist, weighing in on EAT Lancet 2.0 on Brett's show.
I would never issue a document proclaiming that everyone in the world should eat the way I think they should eat.
But of course, she did in her book. While EAT Lancet did not ask anyone to eliminate a whole food category, Georgia wrote, avoiding the seed food family as much as you can, especially grains and legumes, is one of the most important things you can do to protect your brain and overall health. That is the opposite of every dietary guideline for healthy countries and of every healthy population around the world. But of course, the number one objective of every threatened industry is to get the public to doubt the science. And that often means epidemiology, meaning studies that reveal long-term effects. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and dementia usually take decades to develop. Here is Georgia repeating a common industry talking point, which they often include in their PR campaigns.
Nutrition epidemiology, in a nutshell, it's simply a way to generate hypotheses. It's a way to generate theories about what the relationship might be between certain foods and certain health problems. These are guesses, and these are wild guesses. This is my view.
That, of course, is 100% false. Watch my episode. But that is how you cast doubt on 3 years of work from 70 globally acclaimed scientists, whose expertise is relevant for EAT Lancet's 2.0 report, unlike Georgia's expertise. And here's the tragedy. Some Americans will believe her and think, well, if 70 acclaimed scientists can just take wild guesses, what else shouldn't I trust? I recorded that over a week ago, and I've been torturing myself ever since about whether I said enough. I'm afraid you're thinking, shut up, Chris, and get to the Walter Willett interview already. But I guess it was the mocking, the laughing about scientists taking wild guesses. Science denial is like a cancer in America. It metastasizes and leads to so many tragedies, and mocking it just takes it to the next level. So I read her book, wanting to know why we Americans are uniquely vulnerable to science-denying beliefs. And what jumps out is it's a long list of beef industry talking points without investigating the claims. For example, claiming other nations patterned their dietary guidelines after ours. Actually, we originally patterned ours after Sweden's famous 1974 pyramid. Other nations have great scientific teams that devise their own guidelines, and we've interviewed many of them. Georgia wrote, "The lion's share of nutrition studies that make headlines are epidemiological studies, perhaps because they're inexpensive and relatively easy to conduct." If you know anything about epidemiology, you know the ones that make headlines are incredibly expensive and hard to conduct. The Harvard nurses study alone has cost $100 million-ish so far.
We've collected blood samples, urine samples, toenail samples, and that takes actually about $300,000 a year just to provide the liquid nitrogen to keep those samples cold.
They make headlines because the top editors at journals like Nature and The Lancet know how good they are. That is why The Lancet teamed up with EAT Foundation to create the EAT Lancet reports. George's book is filled with claims like that, which could be cleared up simply by talking to the scientists who actually did the work. And that is the mission of our channel. Brett and Georgia could have invited a qualified epidemiologist or nutrition scientist who actually worked on the report, but they didn't. And that is why I visited one who is and who did.
So you talked to Binkai and Chi?
Yeah, good interview with them yesterday.
Great.
A fascinating paper. So the context is we had just interviewed two other epidemiologists the day before, Binkai Liu and Chi Sun. They had published a really good paper on lower carb diets, the way they're practiced by nurses and health professionals. In other words, not extreme low carb. We published that interview a couple months ago. It's kind of shocking to see that the low-carb diet, the way it's practiced by most Americans, increases your risk substantially for type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, I mean, it fits with what we published before, that when we looked at two different versions of the low-carb diet, the animal source is in the wrong direction for total mortality. But it does sort of look like the sweet spot is relatively lower carbohydrate, but with healthy fats and healthy sources of protein.
My newest favorite paper is the one that Ann Julie led with the heat map.
Right, yes.
The heat maps are just so fascinating.
Right, there's a lot of information there, both on the multiple dimensions of aging and also on the many multi-dimensions of diet.
Puzzle me this. Oh, by the way, I added a dark green bar at the top because you were missing it. I don't know why you guys missed this.
What is that?
Dark chocolate.
Oh. Okay. A little bias there.
I have my personal bias.
It's all plant-based.
But the second to the lowest, below sodium and only eking out trans fat is red meat or total meat.
Right.
That's shocking. It's below sugar-sweetened beverages.
Yeah.
Did you see that coming?
Well, it cuts across a lot of different outcomes, for one thing. The single most important thing on a quantitative basis is the average intake of sugar-sweetened beverages is 3 servings a day.
Oh, yeah.
And with red meat, it's about 3 servings a week. Oh. So if this is more on a...
The average American only has 3 servings a week of red meat? What about all the burgers?
Yeah, that's about right, yeah.
Oh, really?
There's quite a range on that.
Oh,
but it's partly chicken's gone up, poultry's gone up
500% over the last 4 decades or something.
Yeah.
And meat has come off a little bit.
It's actually come down about 40% since the early 1970s. Quite a substantial decline in red meat consumption per capita.
Whenever I show that, people go down to starchy vegetables and they freak out. and say, what is that doing down there? That proves epidemiology is a bunch of bull.
Yeah, the Irish said all these potatoes, well, they weren't living.
But not just potatoes. When I asked Feng Lei what that category was, he said it was peas, sort of the immature legumes, because there were some legumes in there in the starchy vegetables.
In this category, yes. The big part, though, is potatoes.
White.
Yeah, right, white potatoes.
So sweet potatoes get a pass?
For now, we haven't really been able to study them adequately because the consumption is pretty low.
What is it about like lima beans and peas? I understand that since they're an immature legume, their glycemic index is higher or something?
Well, they are pretty starchy, yes, and they do have a relatively high glycemic index, although lower than potatoes. Yeah, we've looked at multiple outcomes, including weight, and in general, all the vegetables were inverse except for the starchy vegetables, and there was an increase in body weight with higher starchy vegetables.
Hearing you talk years ago.
But this is driven by potatoes.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
I remember hearing you talk years ago about potatoes, and people were pushing back on you, especially you appeared in some podcasts in the vegan community, and John McDougall was a big, he wrote that book, The Starch Solution, and he was a big fan of potatoes. And it's like, ooh, these two guys have very different views on potatoes. But you got the data.
Right, and we did publish a paper earlier this year looking at potatoes versus whole grains. For most people here in this country and around the world, it's potatoes or grains. The evidence on whole grains being beneficial is very consistent for diabetes, weight gain, and for potatoes, virtually no study shows benefit and sometimes more harm. No matter what form of potatoes, the whole grains look better. So in the Lancet Commission, I think there's nothing we said you have to totally eliminate it from the diet, but we favor.
What are you talking about? All your enemies online are saying you're taking their beef away.
Right, yes.
They're making it a big emotional thing. You're taking their beef away. And they like to quote the daily amount of beef you get. I'm going to show clips of you on stage to debunk all that.
This was an omnivore diet we identified that could include modest amounts of poultry about twice a week. Red meat, not so healthy, but if you like it, about 1 hamburger per week. Or in some diet traditions, there are much smaller amounts of red meat, but put in mixed dishes. We could have those 3 or 4 times a week if it was like 30 or 40 grams per serving.
They take you completely out of context.
Yeah, that's a little frustrating. Either they didn't read the report or they are giving non-truth information.
I think it's probably both.
It could well be both. Part of this is just the inevitable problem of when you have a linear relationship and you say, well, what should be our target or limit? It's going to be somewhat arbitrary. And that's been true for blood cholesterol or blood pressure over the years, where you draw the line. And for every environmental exposure too, as you know well, you can't say 0 of everything. And with more data, the numbers usually go down as you get more and more evidence.
My view of nutrition, I know it's different for poor countries who are malnourished, but there's rarely one big factor. Everything's so multifactorial. But with red meat, there is one big factor. Environmentally, it's catastrophic compared to any of the others. And nutritionally, it's right down at the bottom of your...
Yeah.
And no one is out there but me saying, this is worse than any ultra-processed food. It's the worst thing you can eat. But I think that's what the data says. Am I wrong?
To think about that a little bit. And of course, part of the problem with ultra-processed foods is it's such a heterogeneous category.
Yeah. Well, some people push back on me and say, yeah, but you don't make a diet of Coke, and if you did, that would be disastrous.
Right, yeah.
It's something you drink on the side, whereas you do put beef in the center of your plate.
Although, actually, when we do look at servings per day, the sodas, it's scary. Yeah. So I make the analogy with lobsters. I really like lobsters, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I have them about 3 times a year.
Aren't they getting pretty polluted with PFAS chemicals and things?
Well, even at 3 times a year, it wouldn't make much difference. But the point is that, and it's like the Mediterranean diet and red meat, too. It wasn't an everyday food by any means.
Sure.
It was something that you had maybe once a week or for special occasions. By analogy, I think if people really like red meat, sort of think of it more like lobster or the traditional Mediterranean.
Yeah, I can see that. You can eat a little bit of red meat and still be healthy. Don't you have red meat at Christmas or something every year?
I do have in the summer I usually have a bacon, lettuce and tomato sandwich or 2.
That was my favorite food when I was a kid growing up, when we got to go to the diner. When I was talking to Walter, I felt like I'd gotten into a DeLorean, gone 45 years into the past, and talked to my graduate school advisor. He had a huge reputation among scientists, so he taught a class at Stanford on how to do and how to recognize great science. I'll never forget him saying that in scientific journals, the best papers and the worst papers are the ones that get rejected. The best because they defy conventional wisdom, and the worst because they defy conventional wisdom. And it's really hard, even for editors of scientific journals, to tell them apart sometimes. And the first breakthrough paper typically has some problems with it. It's the subsequent papers that are the more reliable.
Part of the trouble with confusion out there is it's related to, well, several factors. Some of them intentional misrepresentation.
I think.
Also, it's part of the scientific process that's viewed from the consumer general public standpoint, that the New England Journal doesn't want the third or fourth paper. They'll reject it because it's already been published by somebody else. And so what will make the headlines is the first paper, and that's inherently going to be the least reliable evidence. You really want to see the third and fourth paper, and that doesn't make the headlines.
That's fascinating. You've been involved in some pretty epic things, like trans fats.
Mm-hmm.
Talk to me about the trans fat story, because that was many years in the formation, right?
Right, yes. I think probably there will never be such a big disaster within the food supply as trans fat, actually. This is where it was helpful to have my medical background and also my food science background. In food science, I did understand that there was this process called partial hydrogenation going on that was really off the screen of the nutrition world. Basically, the partial hydrogenation was taking these essential molecules and twisting them, their shape, and that was going to change their function.
Oh, interesting.
And they were the precursors of the really important biological pathways. It was really it worried me. This is back in the late 1970s, actually. I was working on a nurse's health study for my thesis and was seeing this would be a good way to collect data on diet, but from the beginning, I wanted to measure trans fat of our participants. It was hard to know what it was going to do. It was like you had a fine working clock of human biology and you're throwing sand in the clock. And who knows what it's going to do, but it's probably not going to be good. And so it was a lot of work to set up to study trans fat. There was no database on trans fat, and so there were a few publications with some foods here, some foods there, and realized we had to analyze a lot more foods to be able to have a comprehensive database so we could take what people reported and then from that calculate their trans fat. It's not just in 1980, but every 4 years we've been updating diet, but also in reanalyzing foods every 4 years to keep our database up to speed. But it did pay off because it did show that when we first had our first paper, we couldn't get it published on trans fat. We tried several American journals. We tried the New England Journal of Medicine. They rejected it.
Why did they reject it?
Well, I think this flew in the face of everybody. Of course, the food industry hated it, but so did the American Heart Association and all the leaders in nutrition community.
Why?
They were saying that saturated fat is everything, and this is distracting from saturated fat.
Doesn't this mimic saturated fat to a large extent?
Well, it partially mimics saturated fat, but it was unique. It did things that no other type of fat did. That it raised LDL cholesterol about equally gram for gram as saturated fat, but it depressed HDL cholesterol and raised triglycerides. Right. So some colleagues in the Netherlands were doing the short-term studies about 1990, and were showing, and actually I could see it in the literature. It was sort of buried in the literature that trans fat was behaving differently of studies done in the early 80s. It was clearly acting bad in the short-term studies, and then yes, we saw it in our large long-term studies related to heart disease. So finally I sent it to Lancet, which has been, actually Lancet has played an important role. They've taken on sort of edgy topics that fly in the face.
Like the EAT Lancet report.
Right, yes. They're really bringing the environment in the broader context of health.
I saw the chief editor was the sort of, he was the MC for your announcement. He did a good job.
Yeah, right.
He's a spirited guy.
Yes, and he's been the editor for decades, actually.
Wow.
So this is his life work.
I'm so proud to welcome and lend the stage to the Lancet. So please welcome its editor-in-chief, Richard Horton.
You will hear criticism that we are advocating a nutritionally deficient diet, a so-called malnourishment diet, or that we somehow represent a totalitarian dietary technocracy. These accusations, needless to say, are entirely false and untrue. What we actually advocate is entirely the opposite. We advocate choice and we advocate freedom. We advocate the freedom to choose healthy foods, healthy environments, and decent work.
The Lancet did accept it. But again, the nutrition, heart disease prevention community really hated it. Some of my heroes wrote letters to the editor that were attacking us.
I did not know that. This is all new to me. I didn't know that.
Because they were telling people to eat margarine instead of butter.
Yeah.
And that margarine, much of it was loaded with trans fat, had worse impact, actually, when you looked at how it affected metabolism than butter, which isn't good in itself.
I noticed on your heat maps that margarine is still, it's way down there.
Well, trans fat specifically.
The ones that contain trans fat.
Right, yes. At that time when our paper came out, the margarine industry, these industries are traded like baseball cards, actually.
Tell me all about it. I came out of environmental epidemiology.
Right, yes. And it turned out that all the major margarine brands in the United States were owned by tobacco companies. And so their CEOs were not getting up in the morning and saying, what can I do to make Americans healthier?
I know.
Again, in Europe, they hired engineers and nutrition scientists. In the US, they hired lawyers and PR people. They were trashing us. In Europe, they did take it seriously, though. I still suggested myself use liquid plant oils whenever possible, but for some people who really have a hard time making that switch, or a few applications, and you want a solid fat, the margarines today are much different than the margarines than we studied.
You had to volunteer a lot of things that were not necessarily scientific, but for the good of public health.
I had a really good partnership with Center for Science in the Public Interest. Those wheels turned slowly. It was really important to get trans fat on the food label. Actually, I'm told by the people in later years in the food industry that they were doing their surveys about consumer knowledge and what consumers thought. And when trans fat was there, their surveys were seeing people didn't understand trans fat, but they knew it was sort of bad and they could lose some of their market share. And so that was a strong motivator to take trans fat out of their products. I think if the surveys had showed that trans people didn't care about trans fat, well, I would hypothesize they wouldn't do too much, wouldn't have done too much about it. But then it was still used by the restaurant industry because they have no food labels, and it really took
famously theaters too, right?
Yeah, theaters, right? Yes, where there's no labels. It makes you a little cynical, even though the evidence says there.
Tell me about
if
it.
you didn't have to disclose,
it's actually soul destroying. So I wanted to ask you about epidemiology overall. So I always hear that randomized trials are the gold standard, and that with epidemiology, this is the industry talking point, and these guys who are trying to discredit EAT Lancet, they all say, oh, it's observational. It's the science of coincidence. Maybe you can get a hypothesis from it, but you can't go further than that. But it seems like the trans fat thing is an example, just like mercury, lead, asbestos, smoking, you name it, that you can infer causality. The randomized control trials can give you some extra insights, but you're not going to know much unless you have epidemiology. Am I wrong about that?
Well, that's right. It is interesting that the causal inference is out there as a buzzword now. Actually, there's really nothing new here. We have some more detailed statistical methods, but the principles were in a whole chapter in the first textbook on epidemiology from the 1960s by Brian McMahon. Underlying this is the potential for confounding, and of course, that's what we learn about in our first classes in epidemiology in any school where epidemiology is taught. And there are many different ways to deal with confounding. And of course, we're getting better at it as time goes on, that now we can have our participants geocoded because we know their address, we know how close they are to power plants and things like
for
that.
electromagnetic and also air pollution.
Air pollution, sun exposure, and distance from fast food restaurants.
That probably makes a difference.
There's dozens and dozens of variables that we can use geocoding to be part of our analysis. One other simple way of controlling confounding is restriction. And that's sort of probably the first order, and that's exactly...
What does that mean?
Well, that means you select a study population that's as homogeneous as possible.
Like the nurses.
Like the nurses or British doctors, because that eliminates confounding factors. If you can basically say, look at people who never smoke, that's a really good way of control, the best way to control for smoking. So now if you do too much restriction, you might reduce the range of your exposure that you want to study.
So for example, with the nurses study, they're 95% white, right?
Right.
So in terms of drawing conclusions about lactose intolerance, I would think...
Right. There will be some things that you can't study because you've reduced the variation in exposure. But underlying human biology is actually pretty similar around the world. Now, you have to do it with some thought. And the response to dairy foods might be different given a population that has high lactose. Or if you want to study soy products, we don't have the range of exposure or range of consumption that you would find in China, for example. So you might want to do your study in China. For the things we want to study, you have to look at that very carefully. Are you going to maintain enough contrast and exposure even though you've done some restriction? We also have devoted a lot of attention to measurement error, and that's actually, from my background in physics, measurement is really at the foundation of physics in so many different aspects.
I'm a geophysicist by background.
So yes, you learn a lot about error in physics, and that applies to diet, except you're looking at the 10th decimal point in many physics applications. We're looking at the first 1 or 2 decimal points, but the principles are still there. So for all of our studies, we've taken a subsample of our population and then collected very detailed dietary data, weighing and measuring everything that they ate for several weeks, and also collected a lot of biomarkers with 24-hour urine samples and repeated blood samples, so we can actually calibrate our questionnaire against these much more detailed studies.
And things like that.
Right, fingernails for some things, for trace elements, they're pretty good. There's, again, no one biomarker that's good optimal for all nutrients. And for many aspects of diet, actually, there are no good biomarkers, like glucose intake. Well, your blood glucose goes all over the place, not really appreciably related to diet.
So on the EAT Lancet report, I saw you on stage when you unveiled it in Stockholm. So I wanted to ask you about your guideline compared to some of the country guidelines we're seeing. Sure. Because there were a few things that stood out to me. One is fish was a very small sliver here.
Yeah, and we go back and forth discussing this. Do you make the size of the slices of pie in proportion to calories or in proportion to volume?
This looks like volume.
No, we're a bit of schizophrenic, actually.
Oh, really?
The left side is by volume.
Fruits and vegetables. Because I was going to say that. How could that be caloric?
Yes, and the right side is by calories.
I see. Okay. That clarifies a lot. So the other one that stands out at me is this wedge for unsaturated oils. Yeah. So at least in America, everybody's insanely gripped by seed oils, being so bad for you and everything. And I have to admit that, I think I told you this last time we visited, that it's not intuitive to me that those oils are healthy because they've got the fat stripped out. They don't like ultra processed. The protein is stripped out, and the fiber and everything else, and you're using a solvent to extract it from the canola seed and all those kinds of things. It sounds all scary and everything. But the data that you're producing, that it's verified by everybody else, is they seem to be healthy. Why are they so healthy?
They're probably healthy in multiple ways. For one thing, of course, it's useful to look at the traditional Mediterranean diet, which it was olive oil. I think if we had unlimited supply of olive oil, we'd be more comfortable making that slice all olive oil. This is, you could say, taking the place of olive oil that might be in the traditional Mediterranean diet. There have been countless studies going back to Ansel Keys' studies back in the 1950s and 60s.
I love those studies.
Right, well-controlled randomized trials. Polyunsaturated fat reduces LDL cholesterol, especially if it's replacing saturated fat. We spend a lot of time shifting the emphasis from total fat to the type of fat. Going back to the seed oils, we know at a minimum that they will reduce LDL cholesterol and keep HDL cholesterol at about the same level. They don't reduce HDL cholesterol like carbohydrates in general. Pretty much all carbohydrates would. But you can't account for all of that benefit with just the change in LDL cholesterol. They also come with a lot of minor constituents. You have to go back to seeds, which are so interesting. They're little packages that contain a living organism there, the embryonic plant. That embryonic plant is basically protected and able to survive for years. These seeds are designed to protect that living tissue. First of all, you seal it off with lipid, so oxygen can't get at it so well. And then you put lots of antioxidants and protective things that protect the tissue in there. So these oils are loaded with other minor constituents as well that are probably part of the picture, with olive oil as well.
And don't they slow down the glycemic index of the foods you're eating?
Right. And then we're also seeing that polyunsaturated fats have lots of other metabolic benefits besides reducing LDL cholesterol. They actually can have anti-inflammatory effects and reduce insulin resistance. There was a simple idea that there's just one pathway, but human biology has many pathways interacting.
Amazing.
To the extent we've looked at it so far, polyunsaturated fat is even better than monounsaturated fat. And we've published a paper recently looking at fatal dementia. To look at olive oil, we see a strong inverse association, but with seed oils, we see basically the same relationship.
I chased that paper down, and what a difference between that and the anecdotes you see on the internet. For example, the scientists performed actual genotyping for dementia genes for a large portion of participants. People who have 2 copies of the APOE4 gene, as 23andMe says I have 5 to 9 times the risk of dying from dementia. When you hear an anecdote on the internet about someone, you never have even a small fraction of the detail that this expensive Harvard study had about its 91,000 participants. The paper made 4 landmark observations. Number 1, the people who ate half a tablespoon of olive oil per day had 28% lower risk of dying from dementia than people who ate none. Number 2, that number was not affected by whether it was olive oil or other vegetable oils. That's a shock, not the impression we get from the internet. Number 3, the size of the effect stayed about the same whether you were already on a healthy diet or were putting Oreos in your face. And number 4, big surprise to me, the risk reduction stayed about the same regardless of your genetic risk factor. I had hoped maybe I'd see a bigger risk reduction because of extraordinarily high risk I started with.
It's not that we had all these pathways in mind. We started off just going back to the 50s, what does it do to blood lipids? But the biology is much more complex, and fortuitously it looks like the seed oils actually have lots of other benefits besides just effects on blood lipids.
I noticed it's a very small wedge for palm and coconut.
Right.
What was it like to be selected for the EAT Lancet Commission and work with these environmental scientists like Johan Rockström? He's got a big reputation.
Well, that was really one of the special benefits of being on this commission, was to work with people from other disciplines and from other countries too, where their culture, the eating culture and food systems were so different. But specifically working with Johan Rockström was a real special privilege.
In earth science, he's considered a towering figure, like you are in nutrition.
Well, it was really good to work together, and I think we learned a lot from each other, especially I think what Johan has done with the planetary boundaries concept, which, like everything else, gets pushed back. But there has to be limits to the tolerable amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, or there's obviously water limits and land use. These are finite.
If you're an earth scientist, it's just crazy. I don't know how Johan does it. I mean, it's one thing with diet, you're going to live 10 years less, you're going to have a heart attack or cancer or something like that. But there's some big stakes on the planetary stuff.
Absolutely. And I think as someone who's spent their career looking at the health picture, that I do have to say that the climate change, environmental issues, but especially climate change, which is so many of these processes are irreversible. This does concern me really actually more than the health issue. Environment, there's no going back.
We're going to miss the Amazon when it's gone. Amazon deforestation, it's going, primarily driven by beef. There's no ruminants in the Amazon. There's some small deer, I guess, that are ruminants, but they get eaten by the jaguars and they have to compete with other herbivores. No, cows are an invasive species in the Amazon that are taking it down.
But you could also say that positively, and some of the behavioral scientists say we should focus on the positive. So
let's focus on the positive. Here's my take on the positive, and you tell me if I've got this wrong. People are distressed about climate change more and more. They're not denying it as much anymore, which is really good to see. But what can I do? Well, I can get an e-bike, maybe that, so I don't drive my gas car so much. I can try to minimize plastic use. But I say just eat the chicken burgers, drink the soy milk instead of the dairy milk. You'll get healthier anyway. It's the worst food you can eat for health, or almost.
Right.
And it's the best thing any individual can do for the environment.
The good thing about it is something that an individual can do.
You can do it. We're all empowered to do that.
Right, exactly.
It's very positive.
So it is positive, and I think we do like to emphasize the multiple dimensions. Good for the planet, good for your own health. Usually can be good for the pocketbook, except we subsidize it so much here in this country. And actually, what I've learned too, I grew up with red meat probably at least every day, if not twice.
So you probably didn't like what you learned about epidemiology because you wanted to keep eating the beef and drinking the milk.
Well, I've learned actually partly because of working with the Mediterranean diet and my colleagues there and other cultures, that what I eat now is much more interesting, much more varied, much more enjoyable than mashed potatoes, roast beef, and gravy that I grew up with.
I think I'm looking at an epidemiologist where the world has gone mad over the EAT Lancet report that you recently did.
Okay, I didn't see that one.
So this one's really interesting. This is an 82-page report on how the beef industry influencers and the beef industry itself did a coordinated PR campaign proactively against the original EAT Lancet report because they knew what impact it would have in 2019. And then again in 2025. They beat you to the punch with posting online. They made it a culture war. They made it personal. They did all the things. You're elite and you're trying to control the masses. You don't want them to have the meat. You want to eat all the meat and all that. And I understand it was kind of demoralizing for your team in 2019. A lot of scientists, like Marco Springman, a very well-respected guy. And he was depressed enough to not want to work on the next report for a year until he got over all the vicious personal stuff. So how do you hold up to that?
Well, one thing is I don't have a social media account, so I try to stay out of that world and keep my eye on the science. That keeps me busy enough.
And you don't try to rebut any of that stuff?
Basically, not much. Occasionally there will be something that somebody sends me that I can make a factual response to.
Okay, so let me give you an opportunity to make a factual response. Nina Teicholz, they go after the people who have the biggest impact, the biggest names. So Christopher Gardner now with the twin study, you for sure, they've been after you forever. And so Nina likes to publish everywhere. She had a Substack, I think last year, where she said, Harvard has been anti-meat for 30 plus years. Why? Well, it's because of Walter Willett. And for example, he's ideologically aligned with a church that promotes vegan diets. I think she's talking about the Adventists, right? And didn't you help Gary Fraser design the Adventist 2 study or something?
Right, yes. First of all, there's nothing wrong, I think, with working with an Adventist. There's some very
I've interviewed 4 of them on my channel, and they're wonderful.
Right,
so,
yes.
In
principle, there's nothing wrong with giving them a hand when it could be helpful in getting their studies started. So, yes, I was on their external advisory committee, especially getting Adventist Study 2 started. But that was about 20 years ago, actually.
Did they buy you a Mercedes-Benz or anything?
No, I think they did pay my way to Loma Linda for the meetings. But I don't remember that I got any compensation for it. It is also, I've been accused by Nina Teicholz for having all these conflicts of interest by being on a bunch of boards. But I think she doesn't understand the difference between a board for a for-profit company and a non-profit organization.
So
where
these
you're
are all
usually expected to actually, these are non-profit boards. You're usually expected to contribute actually for these
Everything I
non-profit
say
boards.
Infuriates her, so this will infuriate her too. I know you're watching, Nina. I think she does know. And I just think she's laundering beef industry talking points. That's my opinion, and I think the tell is, with social media influencers who stick to their points no matter the evidence, when you debunk them and you show them hard evidence, and politicians do this too, and when they come back and repeat that same point and don't acknowledge anything, my suspicion is they're laundering beef industry points.
For somebody like Nina Teicholz, this is her business, and this is her income, that she can't deviate from that.
Keen observers of disinformation will have picked up on the coded language that industries use. Nina named her blog Unsettled Science, a term used by the bigs like ExxonMobil in their ads, or substituting the word authorities for scientists. because Americans have a negative attitude towards authorities, or using the term mandatory for dietary guidelines because we Americans are uniquely susceptible to anyone who claims they are coming for our freedom. And by intentionally using the word they instead of explaining who, it opens us up to conspiracies even better for disinformers. But perhaps the most successful PR strategy in American history is to appear to embrace gold standard science while using it for disinformation. And by gold standard science, they usually mean the randomized control trial, which can be gold standard, but can also be complete nonsense. This is Nina's go-to move. And who better to explain the very simple principle on when it's gold standard and when it's nonsense? I think you told Simon Hill we just wouldn't know much if we limited ourselves to randomized control trials.
If we limited ourselves to randomized controlled trials, we'd be pretty ignorant. If we were interested in does smoking cause lung cancer? Let's do a randomized trial. Get your usual funding for 5 years. There will definitely be no difference in lung cancer risk.
Maybe even positive. You might lose a little weight, you might relax, you might be happier. So smoking is positive, right?
Right, yes, for sure. You might say, well, we need to go longer to 10 years. Still, there's going to be nothing, all these side benefits, which a lot of people did actually promote.
My mom had a master's in organic chemistry from Cornell, and she said, no, smoking is healthy for me.
Yeah, that works. People feel better. And, well, it was the peace pipes, actually. The tobacco was a way to bring people together. It looks like you probably need to smoke about 30 years before you start to see an increase in lung cancer.
That's what I thought. I've been saying 20 years. But so, lung cancer and also the way your skin looks and everything, because I think your skin looks actually a little better when you first start smoking.
Lots of things.
A little more blush to it or something like that. And then after 30 years, it doesn't look so good anymore.
Right. So you'd come away from your randomized trials with completely the wrong answer.
Yeah.
Or you'd do it the other way. Say, well, let's take people who are smoking and randomize people to smoking elimination or not. And there actually have been a few such trials that were done, like the Mr. Fit trial, which was the biggest, most expensive trial ever done. Your conclusion was smoking has no effect on mortality or lung cancer. So these so-called gold standard randomized trials are sort of fool's gold. And
it's a corporate talking point. Because even in environmental epidemiology, like PFAS chemicals, DuPont's going to take you to court, or you're going to take DuPont to court, and they're going to say, where are the randomized control trials?
Unfortunately, in nutritional epidemiology, in many cases, we have the opportunity to combine randomized trials with short-term responses. And like for trans fat, that was really important. When you had that combination of evidence, and you, again, like a court case, you're putting stones on one side of the equation, yes or no. And when you add more pieces from different kinds of studies, different kinds of outcomes, and they all come down on one side, that gives you a lot more confidence. Like trans fat, that worked really nicely. Other areas, like cancer, we don't have as many intermediate endpoints as we do. So in some cases, we don't have that luxury, that added dimension. But in many, that's what we generally try to do, is look not just at one type of study, not just our long-term observational studies, but where do we have other evidence, ideally from humans. Sometimes animal studies can help, but we are pretty different usually in species. Of course, all of this is dealing with certainty and decision analysis, where you're never exactly 100% sure that there could be data errors or some factor we didn't control for.
You're speaking like a scientist. You're speaking like a scientist. The influencer voice, as it's called online, is you speak emphatically. Whether you have doubts or not, you speak emphatically.
Right.
and scientists don't do that. But consumers like people speaking emphatically. They even like their doctor to do that. But scientists like people to speak like you do and say, well, we're not 100% sure. And consumers say, well, if you're not 100% sure, I don't have to worry about mercury and asbestos and all that.
Well, it's one journalist did say, actually, maybe we should come at this with, you want to be the smart gambler. Even though you're not 100% sure, you want to put the odds in your favor.
Yeah. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah, and I think that's...
And big data is why the house always wins, right?
Yeah,
or wins more often than you do.
Right. I think I like that perspective better, and that it makes sense to people. A lot of people gamble.
That's a great perspective.
Yeah.
I like that. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that randomized trials aren't gold when clear objectives can be measured in the short term, and here comes the rain. For example, I just had extensive bone scans done, and my doctor said I have below average bone scan for a man of my age. How could that happen? I get plenty of calcium and vitamin D, and I do long triathlons. He explained that swimming and biking don't generate good bone density, which I knew, but he also explained that long-distance running is associated with low bone density, which I did not know. So I hired a trainer and said, I need good bone density because I still skateboard and rollerblade and I don't want to shatter when I fall. And for short-term studies of weight-bearing exercise and bone density, randomized control trials are the gold standard. And as Walter explained, when you can combine short-term randomized trials with long-term studies, that's even better. So what are my takeaways? Well, I don't have to like it, but I do admire the skill of the corporations, the PR firms they hire, and the influencers. They really have succeeded in shaking the faith of Americans in nutrition and climate science. And they got us fighting with each other over culture wars, just like politicians do, which creates even more confusion.
Politicians have done a really good job of tricking Americans into fighting about issues that were never an issue to begin with, so that you don't pay attention to the issues that actually are. You know?
Number 2, deciding who to trust is not intuitive because we're used to the best stuff like comedy skits from SNL having the highest views.
I must confess, it feels a little complicated, sir. Why not use meters and kilometers?
We will, soldier. But only in certain unpopular sports like track and swimming.
But in nutrition, it's kind of the opposite, right? Have you ever seen Walter go viral? And it's getting much worse because we're falling for AI-driven clickbait doctors in droves. This AI avatar, who intentionally shares the name of actual doctors, has 659,000 views in 2 weeks for claiming that reheating everyday foods causes pancreatic cancer. He uses technical terms that he pronounces differently every time he tries.
And form compounds called nitrosamines. Burn that word into your head. Nitrosamines. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies nitrosamines as probable human carcinogens.
And you can see in the comments section why Americans are falling for this. Lack of trust in science and institutions. For example, Mongoose the Snake Killer wrote a popular comment. Why hasn't the American Cancer Association made this information available to us? And a popular response was, because they make money on you being sick, that's why. Actually, the correct answer is because it's fake. I think the real answer is the best information comes from successful career scientists. Success means their papers consistently get published in top journals like Nature and The Lancet, as Walter's do. They get funding from sources like the NIH, as Walter does, not from industry. Their findings stand the test of time, as Walter's have, even though he has published many times on topics that were controversial at the time, like trans fats. And they don't have shady side hustles. And I think it's actually a good sign when an industry-linked influencer like Nina goes after somebody like Walter, can't find anything, so they have to make it all up. Our mission is to find the best scientists, authors of the best papers, and help them tell their stories. We host doctors, too, who understand science and follow it in their practices. They are our heroes and among the very best of us.